and African Free Trade Area integration.
For over 30 years, Japan and Africa have built solid trust through TCAD.
The ambitious agreement also hopes to harmonize the policies of African countries.
While the West debates aid and debt relief,
Japan wanted to celebrate friendship with Africa, but instead it triggered street protests at home. A cultural project linking 4 Japanese cities with Ghana, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Tanzania suddenly spiraled into chaos, fueled by rumors of mass African migration. Within days, the story of partnership became one of panic and xenophobia. How did a simple exchange program turn into one of Japan's biggest controversies of 2025? Let's find out. When the curtains rose on TICAD 9 in August 2025, Japan wanted to showcase something symbolic, something that would signal it was ready to step closer to Africa. Amid hundreds of cooperation deals in infrastructure, energy, and healthcare, one softer initiative drew special attention: the Hometown Project. The Japan International Cooperation Agency (JICA) announced that 4 cities, Saitama, Fukuoka, Shizuoka, and Osaka, would be paired with Ghana, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Tanzania. It was meant as a gesture of friendship, built on the legacy of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, when African athletes had trained and competed in those very cities. The idea was to maintain those connections, extending them through cultural festivals, youth exchanges, and educational workshops. But what should have been a moment of applause and goodwill became something very different. Almost overnight, the project's announcement started trending online in Japan, not with excitement, but with alarm. Posts began circulating on X and TikTok, claiming that this was not about cultural exchange at all. Instead, it was painted as a covert immigration scheme that would allow Africans to settle in Japan under special visas. Hashtags about African migration and protect Japan's identity shot up in popularity, spreading far beyond political circles into mainstream discussion. Within days, right-wing activists were out in force. In Shinjuku, Tokyo's busiest commercial district, a group gathered waving signs that read, "No to mass immigration" and "Protect Japan's future." Similar demonstrations cropped up in Osaka and Yokohama, fueled by speeches that warned of a silent plan to bring thousands of Africans into Japanese cities. Loudspeakers carried rhetoric about crime, unemployment, and even public health risks, with one protest leader shouting about Ebola as if it were about to arrive on the next flight from Lagos or Dar es Salaam. The protests weren't massive in number, but they were loud enough to dominate headlines. Japanese television aired footage of angry crowds, their chants echoing against glass office towers, while newspapers ran headlines about a divided reaction to the Africa Project. For Africans watching from abroad, the coverage was jarring. What had been announced as a cultural handshake was being recast as a national security threat. In Accra and Lagos, some radio stations even debated whether Japan was backtracking on its promises. Confusion deepened when certain African outlets, rushing to report the news, repeated the visa claim without verification. To ordinary Africans, it looked as if Japan was inviting them in. To ordinary Japanese, it looked as if their government was opening the floodgates. Both interpretations were wrong, but by the time the truth began to surface, the damage had already been done. The breaking news cycle seized on the story, amplifying every protest, every angry slogan, and every misleading headline. By the end of August, Japan's Africa outreach was no longer a diplomatic talking point. It was a domestic scandal. The very phrase, African hometown, had become toxic in Japanese politics, dragged from the warm language of cultural partnership into the cold glare of identity politics. And so, the question shifted. If the project itself was harmless, how did it become so badly misunderstood? Who twisted the meaning? And why did the narrative of migration take root so quickly in a country that prides itself on control? To understand why the controversy spiraled so wildly, we first need to look at what Japan was actually trying to achieve. The Hometown Project was not a policy about visas, immigration, or permanent settlement. It was a symbolic move, born out of a very different logic: soft diplomacy. JICA, Japan's powerful development agency, designed the program to root Japan-Africa ties in the lives of ordinary citizens rather than just at the level of governments or corporations. The blueprint was simple, yet intentional. Each chosen Japanese city had a link to Africa from the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. During the Games, athletes from across the continent had trained and competed in these communities, leaving behind stories, friendships, and impressions. Officials saw an opportunity to transform that fleeting Olympic spirit into something lasting, a living bond between cities and nations. The Hometown Project then was meant to take those memories and institutionalize them, turning one-off encounters into structured cultural partnerships. This was no small symbolic gesture. In Japanese diplomacy, symbolism carries weight. The country has long struggled with how to engage Africa in a world where China, the United States, and the European Union have raced ahead with massive investment footprints. Japan, lacking the sheer financial firepower of Beijing or Washington, often leans on symbolism, cultural diplomacy, and carefully designed exchange programs to make its presence felt. By pairing Japanese communities with African nations, Tokyo was signaling, "We are not just investors. We want to be part of your story too." At TICAD 9, the message was reinforced with numbers. Over 300 cooperation agreements were signed with African partners, covering technology, infrastructure, healthcare, and climate resilience. The Hometown Project may have been small in scale compared to billion-dollar deals, but it was a piece of a larger puzzle, positioning Japan as a human-centered partner in Africa's development. For Tokyo, this was an attempt to stand out in an increasingly crowded playing field. For African nations, it was recognition that their presence mattered not just at the negotiation table, but also in the cultural and social imagination of a faraway power like Japan. There was also a generational logic behind the project. Japan's leadership knew that Africa is the world's youngest continent, with nearly 70% of its population under the age of 30. Creating youth exchanges, training programs, and cultural links was not just about today's diplomacy. It was about cultivating ties with the African leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators of tomorrow. In the eyes of JICA, these symbolic hometown pairings would plant seeds of goodwill that might bloom decades later in ways that trade deals alone could not guarantee. Yet for all its ambition, the project suffered from a fatal weakness: communication. The language of hometowns was catchy but vague. To Africans reading headlines from abroad, it sounded as if Japanese cities were opening themselves to adopt African partners in a permanent sense. To Japanese audiences, already anxious about immigration, the word was easily twisted to imply residency rights and long-term stays. What Tokyo intended as a gesture of soft diplomacy was misunderstood as a hard policy shift. This gap between intention and perception proved decisive. Instead of being celebrated as a bridge between continents, the Hometown Project was dragged into Japan's domestic battles over identity and immigration. And so the question arises, if the initiative was built on symbolism and goodwill, how did it morph into a story about migration? What forces, online and offline, transformed cultural exchange into a national crisis? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The Hometown Initiative may have been born out of symbolism, but the way it was received owed little to culture or diplomacy. What transformed it into a national crisis was not the project itself, but the stories told about it. Within hours of JICA's announcement, narratives began circulating that had little grounding in fact, but immense power in shaping public perception. It started with a handful of misleading headlines. Some African outlets, eager to report on Japan's new outreach, published stories that framed the project as a program offering special visas to Africans. These headlines, while perhaps careless rather than malicious, planted the seed of confusion. Social media took that seed and watered it with exaggeration. On X, posts claimed thousands of Africans would soon arrive in Japanese cities. TikTok videos speculated about African families settling permanently, their children attending Japanese schools, and entire neighborhoods transforming overnight. This narrative resonated in Japan for a reason. The country has long been uneasy about immigration. With one of the lowest foreign resident populations among developed nations, Japan has historically prided itself on cultural homogeneity. Any suggestion of large-scale migration, particularly from regions stereotyped as different or difficult to integrate, immediately triggers anxiety. That anxiety was the perfect fuel for misinformation. Soon, the rumors took on a life of their own. Online forums that typically debate everything from video games to neighborhood gossip suddenly turned into battlegrounds about African visas. In comment sections, fears spiraled. Would Japanese workers lose jobs? Would crime rates rise? Would healthcare systems be overwhelmed by diseases supposedly carried from abroad? These questions, grounded in prejudice rather than reality, spread faster than official corrections ever could. Right-wing groups quickly recognized an opportunity. Japan's far right has long campaigned against immigration, often targeting ethnic Koreans, Chinese, and Southeast Asian workers. Now, they had a new symbol: Africa. They organized rallies in major cities, plastered neighborhoods with posters warning of an African influx, and used provocative slogans like "Defend Japan's Purity." For these groups, it didn't matter that no visas were being issued, no permanent settlement was planned, and no migration policy had changed. What mattered was the image of Africans as a looming threat, an image they could weaponize to advance their broader agenda against globalization. The mainstream media, too, played a role. Though most outlets did not endorse the rumors, their coverage of protests and public outcry amplified the sense of crisis. Evening news shows featured footage of demonstrators chanting angrily, often without context about the project's real purpose. Newspapers framed the issue as a divided reaction, suggesting there were two equally valid sides, when in fact, one was based entirely on falsehoods. In this way, even cautious reporting gave legitimacy to misinformation by placing it on the same level as fact. For Africans observing this saga, the distortion was striking. In Ghana, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Tanzania, where the project had been celebrated as a rare acknowledgement of cultural partnership, it suddenly appeared as if their countries were being blamed for stoking panic abroad. Social media users across Africa expressed confusion, some even anger, at how a symbolic gesture could be twisted into a story of invasion. The irony was painful. The very people meant to benefit from cultural bridges were being cast as villains in a narrative of fear. This was not just a misunderstanding. It was a case study in how fragile international cooperation becomes when misinformation finds fertile ground. What began as symbolic diplomacy was hijacked by rumor, fear, and prejudice, reshaping the conversation entirely. And when fear becomes louder than fact, governments are forced to act, which raises the next critical question. Faced with this storm of falsehoods and protests, how did Japan's leaders try to contain the damage? And did their clarifications do anything to restore trust? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time protests erupted across major Japanese cities, the government in Tokyo knew it had no choice but to intervene. The misinformation storm had grown too large to ignore, and silence risked letting rumors harden into truth in the public imagination. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba stepped in front of cameras for a televised statement, not to boast about Japan's new Africa initiative, but to deny what it wasn't. With measured words, he assured the nation there would be no mass immigration, no new visa scheme, and no permanent residency for Africans under the Hometown Project. It was an unusual spectacle. Leaders rarely highlight what a policy doesn't do, yet the sheer scale of panic forced Ishiba into a defensive stance. He was joined by the chief cabinet secretary, who issued repeated press briefings stressing that the project was symbolic, designed around temporary exchanges for students, athletes, and professionals. "This is about friendship, not migration," one official insisted, a line that would appear in nearly every Japanese newspaper the following morning. JICA, which had originally unveiled the project, also launched a campaign of clarification. Its website carried a detailed FAQ debunking the most common rumors circulating online. No special visas, no automatic settlement rights, no hidden deal to bring in African workers. JICA officials even reached out to African media outlets that had published misleading stories, urging corrections to prevent the panic from spreading further. This was an extraordinary step, not just damage control at home, but a cross-continental effort to repair misunderstandings abroad. Yet despite these efforts, the backlash did not vanish overnight. Protests continued, though smaller in size, and right-wing groups accused the government of covering up the truth. On social media, conspiracy theories mutated. If officials were denying permanent migration so forcefully, perhaps that was evidence that it really was planned. In this way, every official denial seemed to feed the very paranoia it was meant to extinguish. What stood out most in the government's response was its tone of nervousness. Instead of confidently highlighting the benefits of cultural exchange with Africa, leaders seemed cornered, forced to justify why Africans would even be allowed to set foot in Japan temporarily. It was as if the state was on trial, defending itself against charges of treason simply for seeking friendship abroad. For African observers, this hesitation carried its own message. Japan might want Africa's markets, talent, and goodwill, but it still struggled to embrace Africans themselves as partners beyond statistics. This episode also revealed a deeper contradiction in Japan's global ambitions. On one hand, Tokyo has worked hard to brand itself as a responsible international partner, eager to support development in Africa through TICAD conferences, infrastructure investments, and technological cooperation. On the other hand, its domestic politics remain shaped by an insularity that resists cultural openness. The Hometown Project, meant to humanize diplomacy, instead exposed this tension in raw form. In the days that followed, analysts in both Japan and Africa noted how much energy the government spent on firefighting rumors rather than building on the substance of TICAD 9. Instead of celebrating 300 cooperation agreements, headlines focused on angry protests and clarifications about no visas. The intended narrative, Japan deepening its Africa ties, was drowned out by an unintended one: Japan's fear of Africans. The nervous cleanup, therefore, achieved only partial success. It slowed the spread of misinformation, but could not erase the doubts planted in the public mind. More importantly, it left an aftertaste. If Japanese society could react so strongly to a symbolic project, what would happen when cooperation deepened into real exchanges? And that brings us to the final question. What should Africa take away from this backlash? Was this a sign of weakness in Japan's diplomacy, or proof of Africa's growing power to unsettle the world simply by being present? The storm in Japan may have centered on rumors and protests, but the real story lies elsewhere: what it says about Africa's place in the world today. For decades, African nations were treated as footnotes in global diplomacy, recipients of aid, objects of charity, or markets on the periphery. But this episode shows how radically the script has changed. A project as small and symbolic as pairing 4 Japanese cities with 4 African nations was enough to dominate headlines, rattle public opinion, and force Japan's prime minister to address the nation. That is not the reaction a continent on the margins provokes. It is the reaction to a continent whose presence has become unavoidable. From Ghana to Nigeria, Mozambique to Tanzania, Africa is no longer treated as a background player. It is seen, sometimes feared, as a force capable of reshaping the global order. Japan's protests, though rooted in misinformation, are proof of that. They demonstrate that even symbolic gestures with Africa carry weight powerful enough to unsettle societies thousands of miles away. This is the paradox. What frightened sections of the Japanese public was not the reality of Africans arriving, but the idea of Africans having a visible, permanent role in Japan's national imagination. For Africa, the lesson is both sobering and empowering. Sobering because the backlash is a reminder of how prejudice still distorts perceptions of the continent and its people. Even in a country as advanced and outward-looking as Japan, myths about disease, crime, and cultural incompatibility can be conjured up in an instant. But empowering, because it proves that Africa has crossed a threshold. It can no longer be ignored or brushed aside. The mere thought of a deeper African connection was enough to trigger a national debate in one of the world's most insular societies. That in itself is evidence of Africa's growing leverage. The question then is how Africa should use this leverage. The answer is not to shrink from partnerships when xenophobia surfaces, but to continue building with confidence. Africa's value does not rest on the approval of others. It rests on its own demographics, resources, innovation, and culture. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, and new industrialization drives across the continent are all signs that Africa is increasingly charting its own path. When external partners like Japan come forward, Africa should engage, but never at the cost of doubting its own strength. It is also worth remembering that Japan is not the only game in town. While protests erupted in Tokyo, other powers were moving forward with Africa without hesitation. China continues to expand its Belt and Road projects across the continent. India is deepening its trade and technology ties. Russia, Turkey, and Gulf nations are investing in infrastructure and energy. Even within Africa itself, cross-border cooperation is accelerating, with regional blocs linking economies in ways unthinkable a generation ago. In this crowded field, Japan risks falling behind if its domestic politics cannot keep up with its diplomatic ambitions. For Africans, that risk is not a problem, it is leverage. If Japan hesitates, there are other doors wide open. If misinformation sparks xenophobia, Africa can continue working with partners that recognize its people as collaborators rather than caricatures. And perhaps most importantly, Africans themselves must remember that every backlash abroad is, in a way, confirmation of their rising power. The Hometown Project was supposed to be a small cultural gesture. Instead, it became a moment that revealed both Japan's fears and Africa's ascent. Japan may have tried to reassure its citizens that no Africans were coming to stay. But the truth is, Africa has already arrived on the global stage, and it is not leaving. And that is the final takeaway. Africa does not need permission to shine. It only needs to keep moving forward, confident in the knowledge that its presence is now powerful enough to shake the world, even when it doesn't intend to. Do you think Japan's backlash shows weakness in its society or strength in Africa's rising influence? Let us know in the comment section. Should Africa keep partnering with nations that fear its presence, or focus only on those who embrace it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.